All right, friends, neighbors, thank you for joining us this evening, both live here and virtually, for a question and answer conversation with Ontario's Housing Affordability Task Force. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon territory is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee, or the Haudenosaunee, that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and people, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited to this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'd like to encourage everyone to take time to learn about this treaty on their own time. My name is Eric Lombardi, and I am your host for this evening, as well as the founder of More Neighbors Toronto. For those who are unfamiliar with us, we are a volunteer-only collective of housing advocates, and you can learn more about us if you visit our website, moreneighbors.ca, or follow us on Twitter. This event is also co-sponsored by the Toronto Region Board of Trade and the University of Toronto's School of Cities, without whom this conversation would not be possible. So thank you. I'd also like to welcome the members of the task force for joining us in this conversation. Jake Lawrence is the chair of the task force and the CEO of Global Markets and Banking at Scotiabank. Ian Underwood is a task force member and the CEO of Habitat for Humanity Toronto, a not-for-profit builder of affordable housing in the city. And finally, Tim Hudak, who is a task force member and the CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association. Thank you for joining us. I'll be starting the Q&A momentarily with the first question, followed by 20 minutes of questions from the Toronto Region Board of Trade and the University of Toronto's School of Cities. We will then be taking questions from our live audience here in person and also via Zoom if you're joining virtually. Until 8:25, when my friend Craig Rutan from the Toronto Region Board of Trade will be providing some closing remarks. I ask that everyone do their best to keep their questions to under a minute and preferably under 30 seconds. I also ask, as a courtesy to our guests joining us, that we do not ask any questions about individual politicians or political tactics. However, before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on why we're here tonight. I assume that many of you, like me, believe that Ontario's housing crisis has reached a breaking point. In the last 10 years, the cost of homes in the city has tripled, while incomes have increased at just a fraction of the same rate, at 38%. It now takes a household income of more than $250,000 to afford a median dwelling in Toronto, and you must now be very well into the 1% to afford a detached home. Rapidly and suddenly, only those with family wealth, often through property already, or extremely high incomes can afford to build their lives here. To make matters worse, these rapidly increasing prices for ownership are being chased by rapidly increasing prices for rent, creating a very visibly inhuman level of displacement in our city that we all know, and it poses a major barrier to new Torontonians, young people, racial and sexual minorities, and economic mobile from starting their lives here in Ontario. My personal journey into YIMBYism, known as the Yes in My Backyard movement, started when I was studying engineering at Waterloo. I was very excited to get my first co-op placement in the San Francisco Bay Area, all the way back in 2014. I was floored when I started looking for a place to rent. I was paying $400 Canadian in Waterloo, and I could hardly find a place in Palo Alto for less than $1,500 American. It was insane. I wanted to know how that could be possible. And it was really through this lens that I learned about the myriad of rules and processes that high opportunity places like here in Toronto and across the Anglosphere have created to prevent housing from being built. In many American cities, from Portland to Minneapolis, these policies, such as exclusionary zoning or single-family zoning, are finally coming to be understood for their historic root in racial and class discrimination through a practice that has come to be known as redlining. Unfortunately, since their copycat introduction to cities throughout the Anglosphere, many of these unethical laws have been strengthened and modified at the behest of local residents capable of finding unique and special reasons to prevent or stop housing wherever it's proposed. These residents, for whom progressive or conservative consistency is not relevant, are often described as NIMBYs for their not in my backyard attitude. And while there are other contributing factors to the rising costs of housing in Ontario, including the increased access to capital through low interest rates, to speculative domestic and foreign investment, to the multi-decade absence of all levels of government in the construction of affordable and social housing, the vast majority of the evidence that we see today points to the substantial undersupply of the missing multifamily housing types that these rules have prevented from being built in our sprawling neighborhoods. I believe that we have barely begun to feel the consequences of bifurcating our society into wealthy property-owning classes with political influence and a renter class for whom ownership and participation become increasingly impossible. We must avert with utter urgency this neo-feudal future from wreaking havoc on Canada's generational social contract, our economy, our environment, and our liberal democracy. How will we in Canada and Toronto build a sustainable and prosperous economy when all the new wealth that's created finds its way into the hands of landlords and property values? How will we start the next generation of world-leading businesses and productive businesses when our brightest young people are afraid of leaving stable jobs for fear that their risk will leave them unable to realize their domestic dreams if they fail? Many who can take matters into their own hands are already doing so by making the choice to move to America, where housing is more affordable and incomes are higher, like I initially did, along with about 70% of my university classmates. How will our city function when none of the people it depends upon can afford to live here? Our nurses, teachers, bus drivers, tradesmen, all the other middle and working class people our city needs are now being forced to choose between driving long commutes to places that they can't afford, trapped in car dependency, or to choose to remain here in underhoused environments that are no longer suitable for their changing families. We can do better. How will we respond to the urgency of climate change, which requires us to move people and heat our buildings far more efficiently than we do today? Do we want to get to net zero? How are we going to get there? How will we maintain our liberal democracy if citizens, through absolutely no fault of their own, have become second-class citizens and renters beholden to a new landed gentry? Without the promise and possibility of economic mobility, I believe that our democracy, as we know it, faces a substantial risk. And so while the conversation that we're having tonight may be focused on housing supply, we must keep in mind the greater socioeconomic context that is demanding these urgent reforms. The fact that we've allowed the crisis to reach this point is absolutely insane. In November, Ontario's provincial government convened a task force, to report on a comprehensive package of reforms to increase private market housing supply so that we could end the crisis for the long term. Last Tuesday, the task force came back with 55 key recommendations and called for the construction of 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years. This is an ambitious target, but a huge opportunity for the real, not speculative economy as we double the rate of home building in Ontario. It calls upon the province to finally end exclusionary zoning practices by legalizing multi-tenant housing and fourplexes across the province on every single residential property. It suggests that municipalities finally make better use of existing transit infrastructure by allowing wood-framed mid-rise growth along bus and streetcar routes while transforming our underutilized commercial retail space to be mixed with residential development. This has the potential to finally bring back Main Street culture, enable an aging residents to downsize in place while creating sustainable and complete communities out of our worst suburban sprawl. The recommendations outline a new approach to growth for municipalities by reducing the political influence of anti-housing interests, by establishing reasonable provincial standards, and by encouraging municipalities to approve housing before it requires a ruling by a provincial tribunal. And this is done through carrot and stick incentives. What this report does not discuss is the government's role in directly subsidizing affordable housing, and it does not suggest demand-side solutions. Both are topics that have space in this conversation. However, the 55 measures as reported, if legislated, would be some of the most progressive reforms to housing policy anywhere in the Anglosphere, if not the world. So once again, I would like to thank the task force for being here with us tonight and engaging in this absolutely critical conversation that we're having as a province. And I would be more than thrilled to start with the first question of the evening, which is, what did you learn in this process? And as a result, which reforms do you see as the most critical for the province to get right? Jake, as the chair, I will ask you to start.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Eric, for having me. I know Ian and Tim are also happy to be here, and thanks for those joining us in the room, and I think everyone who's joined us online. Eric, real passionate comments up front, and thank you for all the work you do with more neighbors. Volunteerism is important. We didn't give you a hand when you started, so. Hopefully that means I don't get any tough follow-up questions from you now, but we'll see. So your question was around, what did I learn in the process? So I'm going to ignore your first question. I'm going to modify it if that's okay. And just what surprised me about the process, I'd rather answer, because there were lots of learnings for me, but I think one of the things I took away was just how much alignment there was and how much unanimity across everyone we consulted in the process. So some people may not recall what the process was. We had 2 months after the task force formed, and we didn't want this to be a drawn out process because, like other things in life, they'll just expand to fill the time. And it was important to get a report back with concrete, actionable recommendations. And so what we tried to do is really do intensive consultations and come up with what are the solutions that could be put forward that could be actioned on by the government or governments at the end of the day to try to really make change. And I think Eric's done a great job at highlighting some of the problems and how they actually trickle down. Housing prices starts off as one topic, but how it ripples throughout the rest of our community, impacting who can live in a community, different classes. You can really see the challenges that emerge just from that tipping point. So the thing that surprised me, alignment and unanimity. Whether you were from not-for-profit, whether you were a developer, whether you were from municipalities, it clearly became important that people realize this is an issue. Whether you're left-leaning political views, right-leaning political views, this is going to be an issue for Ontarians writ large. And so that's outstanding because it gives myself, and I hope the rest of the task force and people here, hope that some of the recommendations will be adopted as we move forward. The second part of your question was, what do I see as most critical for the province to adopt to get right? What I'd say to that is, there's a phrase, and I just shared it with Eric, there's a phrase in the cover letter that says our recommendations aren't an all or nothing, right? If you structure it in a way that it's all or nothing, I don't like the bifurcation. You end up with a potential risky outcome. And so there's 55 recommendations. There's a lot of choices on the menu. When we talked as a task force about them, we grouped them in certain categories. The two categories that I think are most important, Eric touched on one of them for sure. Actually, I think he touched on both in his opening comments, is density, right? If we just build more houses, and I travel the world in my job, and people are like, how does Canada have a housing problem? It's such a big country. Like, what's going on there? But if we end up building housing across the country, we can create other problems, whether they're environmental problems. Frankly, I don't want to commute 2.5 hours to my job both ways. I've worked in the US and there are markets where people do that. I don't want to do that. It means I'm further away from getting home to my kids' activities. I have to leave earlier in the morning. Those aren't constructive things. So more density is a solution for people. They can be closer to infrastructure that's built. We think of roads, but it also means schools, it means hospitals, it means universities. So density would be one category that I think we need to make action on. And then the second one is the approval process. One of my favorite stats from the report is the approval process in Canada is the second slowest. I believe it's among the OECD, and it's just ahead of Slovakia. And I think it is 3 times slower than the UK or the US. And I think those are usually markets we like to benchmark to as Canadians and as Ontarians. And so I'll come back to where do I see reforms being most important? First, density, second, approval process. And hopefully I didn't steal your guys' answers because we didn't coordinate. There's lots
Do you
left.
want to go next and leave me the scraps, or how do we work this?
What did we learn, or what did I learn? 3 things. The first one I think is not totally task force, but I think it's within the last year, for me, the point has really sunk in around housing supply. And there was somebody had been one of the editorials in the last week was just okay, it's now irrefutable. We have a housing supply problem in this country. There's lots of things behind what's going on in housing, but you cannot debate there's a housing supply problem. And so, for me, that's the first thing. It also, then juxtaposes against, it's so easy to blame the developers to say, well, all these recommendations are going to help developers build more stuff, make more money. We need developers to build more houses. And so just the fact is we have a housing supply problem, full stop. We need recommendations that enable people who build houses to build more. So that's the first, point. The second is, it was just really gratifying to see the level of, Jake, I'm saying the same as you used the word alignment, unanimity. So, for all of us on the task force, we were 9 members. Many of you were involved in deputations, showing up for consultations, often on 2 days' notice. And I think you said you had 10 days to write your deputation. I said, I think you were one of the lucky ones. And we asked so much of people, and people really stepped up. And the themes, there is such a unanimity of themes. And so part of when you ask the question, I wrote down, we know, meaning and you see it in kind of the editorials and some of the media coverage. Yes, there's noise about these recommendations. Some of it's going to hurt, some of it's politically challenging, but there is we know directionally what we need to do to address what Eric talked about at the beginning of where we are as a society. So that was, for me, working in affordable housing, just really gratifying to see, okay, we do know what we need to do. The third point for me is affordable housing. And obviously I work at Habitat for Humanity. This has been my life for 9 years. And yet from the affordable housing providers who did deputations to us, I was sobered by realizing where we are now with affordable housing. Just this, the thing we had heard quoted many times, for every new nonprofit affordable housing unit that's being built right now, we're losing 15 below market units. Some of those are in the mom and pop rentals that are being bought and converted. Some of them are in affordable housing. So we are losing 15 at a time when we've had a 3 times increase in housing prices in this country in a decade and a half. This is a problem. This is heartbreaking in terms of what it means for people. So for me, those are kind of what did I learn? Those were the 3 things that stayed with me the most. The question of however the words were, what do I most hope the government will do? Or what was the words?
What do you think is the most critical for the government to get right?
So I think the most critical for the government to get right, and maybe it's a bit of a bundle, but it is for me, what I read into the report is this theme of adjusting the balance. We have a land development system right now that favors, candidly, people like me who, were born in the 60s, got a cheap education in the 80s, bought a house in the 90s, and went to sleep every night and made money just from the house. And now we have a We have a land development system that favors people like me to show up, to hear about meetings, to show up at meetings, to say, well, please don't build that. It'll change my life too much. And it's so balanced against everything, Eric, that you spoke about at the beginning. All those of you who are younger, the children you are going to have, we've tilted things against them as well. And certainly the folks who, we work with at Habitat for Humanity. So I see that underlying current in the report says we need to rebalance our definition of democracy when as it relates to decisions about what gets built where for whom. Where do you?
Well, thanks very much, Ian and Eric. I want to say thanks, as my colleagues did, to more neighbors and Toronto Region Board of Trade. I think hopefully come back to it because I got some things I'd like to say about the two groups, particularly in the impact that you guys had. It's great to be here. And Eric, nice to meet you. Jake remarked on your passion. I thought it was an awesome opening comments. When I saw your picture, I thought you looked like a real tough guy, like you're from a Western or something. I can see that. So it scared me a little bit. I'm more relaxed. Look, I think my colleagues gave some great answers there, and I kind of agree. So I'll just add some stuff. I think that the learning experience for me, or maybe a reinforcing one, was let me add one. My colleagues are good ones. Is it pays to be bold. This is one hell of a bold report. Like, it is unapologetically pro finding more affordable housing for people across our province. We didn't pull punches. We didn't water things down. We didn't try to be correct or inoffensive. We actually put out what needs to be done. And you'll see a lot of the stuff that more neighbors and TRBOT put in there in our report. So it pays to be gutsy. And what came out of that, a hell of a lot of momentum in the media, a forum like this, Eric, that you've put together. And I hope that encourages all political parties to get behind it, because we put up a big flag and a lot of people are rallying around it. So let's keep that up. So that's the big takeaway for me. And I'd agree with Jake that I think the most impactful on the ground is going to be that basket of as of right policies. I'm sure we'll explore those in a bit more detail. But if you play by the rules, you follow things, you won't get harassed by NIMBYs or driven out of the neighborhood or whatever, that you can actually find an affordable place to call home in our cities and our small towns. So the one I'll add to that basket then, to just put one more on the table, the other side of the coin is you need carrots too. So there's that little expression, right? You can bring a horse water, but you can't make it drink. Municipalities can always find ways to circumvent processes if they so choose, or slow them down. And at the same time, the province, I hope, will be paying attention to the recommendation report for what we called the Ontario Housing Delivery Fund. So it's a reward for good behavior. So if the municipalities are playing ball, they're welcoming more neighbors, more people into their community, creating affordable home ownership options, they should be rewarded for that. So that's the one I'll put a big circle around. So you've got both sides of the coin. Thanks.
Thank you guys for your opening remarks and also phenomenal answers to the question. I would like to welcome both the Toronto Region Board of Trade and the School of Cities to come up. One of you guys can start, either one, with your questions. Craig, if you would like to start first, that'd be fantastic.
Hello, Craig Rattan. I'm Policy Director for Housing at the Toronto Region Board of Trade, and delighted to be here and supporting this event alongside Eric More Neighbors in the School of Cities. First question, I wanted to pick up a bit more on the as of right zoning that you just referred to as well, Tim. I think what's really exciting about this is that in your report, you not only included any exclusionary zoning for multiplexes in existing residential neighborhoods, one of the things the board called for, but really included a lot of other bold things that people might not have expected, including mid-rise along transit corridors, office to residential conversions, and also rooming houses across the province with sort of no limitations, which I think is really exciting and bold. So can you just speak a bit more to why you thought all of those different pieces are important, and whether there's any other jurisdictions or examples, where you got the inspiration from to include sort of that broad mix of as of right permissions?
I will kick it off. And actually, I think I will kick it off with the multi-tenant housing, or rooming houses, as people think of them. Again, a bit out of scope because we're affordable housing, but the notion was as of right, and we're saying let's change neighborhoods. And for me, I think having the province move on multi-tenant housing is important because as we've witnessed in the city of Toronto, it's just too hard to do at the municipal level. So for me, that was very much why we should have multi-tenant housing in all of our neighborhoods. It creates, homes for international students, students in general, people who are, coming and going. It's a critical part of a housing continuum. We should have that in all of our neighborhoods. So let's just say that as a province. And then for me, the notion of, the full range of single semis towns, up to 4-story. I guess I'll say that thinking of my perspective as Habitat for Humanity, like we've gone into communities and we're stuck building, 6 homes where we should be building 9. I think in particular, my second year in Habitat for Humanity, we were trying to get approvals for a development in Scarborough, which honestly, more than enough space for 20 stacked towns. Didn't have to be back to back. We would have done 20 easily. But because of neighborhood character, we had to fight to get semi-detached, let alone singles. And so 9 families, live in that neighborhood, which is great. We transformed their lives. Should have been 20. It was right along a bus route. So the notion of saying, let's just create an envelope that describes what should be in our communities was for me, the backdrop of why I was and am so supportive of that direction.
Sure. Yeah, Craig, and you guys did an awesome job. Toronto Region Board of Trade deserves a lot of credit. Not only the report you guys did, but you were in the media running up to that and subsequently. And as well, you worked in politics for quite some time yourself, right? That kind of stuff is very meaningful, I think, to decision makers. And I think it reinforced how we felt about our work when we had groups like yourselves that came out and got behind the project. Yeah, that was really bold. And I'll watch my chair here, and Dave Forstall's with us too, similarly a VP at Scotiabank, who played a big role if I'm exceeding what we're supposed to be talking about. We're on closed circuit TV here, right? We had quite a debate, and we had quite a debate internally. This was a hell of a group, all talented individuals, no wallflowers among us from across the housing spectrum. And Jake did an awesome job as chair, because we'd squabble from time to time, but this had a lot of discussion, and ultimately we chose to go a very bold route. So the ability to have up to 4 stories on any lot in the province. Some of the debate, Toronto Region Board of Trade had a position on this in terms of 100,000 over, I think is what you guys said, right? So do we do it for communities 100,000 over, 500,000 over, any community, every town and village? And we went on the bold end of the spectrum that in any residential lot, you can do 4 stories or up to 4 units, which is going to be huge to unlocking affordable home ownership right across our province. One that we heard from other groups, including the Ontario Real Estate Association, an excellent advocacy association on behalf of realtors in the province of Ontario, who said as of right conversion for commercial industrial properties. Industrial is pretty stacked up right now. Like industrial properties are doing pretty well as a class, but as a result of COVID, more things being able to purchase online, a greater comfort with that, you're probably going to have excess space in the commercial sector that's already built. So it's on servicing, it's good for the environment. So an as of right to convert those properties into housing as well is a big part of it. And as you mentioned, I think Regional Board of Trade was big on this too, intensifying along major transit lines up to 11 stories as of right. So you're right, there was a very aggressive package. And as I said, I think that the task force showed a lot of backbone by going on the most bold end, because that will be huge for unlocking ownership.
Add on a couple minor points to complement what Ian and Tim have said. Where we've seen progress made, obviously the Toronto Board of Trade report's been referenced. The province of Ontario, they've started kicking this off with some of their work around housing a couple of years ago, but we're seeing right now the conversion of a large building on Wall Street in New York to rental. The way of work is changing, the way of school is changing. So why make it hard on people to find places to live when we could have vacant commercial buildings or industrial buildings, to build off what Tim had said. BC is working on the same topic. Maybe they're not at the degree of boldness that we've tried to put forward here. We've seen progress in certain Pacific Northwest communities in the US, other parts of the Northern Midwest like Minnesota. So part of the reason we produced the report relatively fast is one, there's no silver bullet. So debating will just fill time. And a lot of the people engaged, whether they're from the housing continuum, the social starting housing, or developers on the high end, they all have a view and the solutions should all be considered across it. There's not a lot of new ideas coming up here. So we gathered, collected, and curated, to be honest, from a lot of great people, including people joining us tonight in the process. But at the end of the day, we stole from some places around the world, borrowed, maybe is probably the better choice of words, and tried to put the best of the best together. Yeah.
Here's a great example of why this is necessary. So we talk about as of right for garden suites, laneway housing and such, another bold recommendation, right? And so I think the city of Toronto and Mayor Tory for sure is behind this. They're very well meaning. They're trying to do more laneway homes. But Craig, I don't know if you know like how many they've actually succeeded in getting after years of consultation. And municipalities do their best, but they confront local voters and very slow process. So this shows why, you know, as of right, I think we'll actually get those things built, because even probably the most progressive city is moving at a snail's pace. We can't wait any longer.
Which is perfect. Sets me up really well for my second question, which is around, I think one of the criticisms that we're starting to hear a bit, I expect others to come out, is to say, okay, maybe some of these ideas could work in Toronto. Maybe it's necessary in Toronto with the issues they're facing and the types of housing they have, where people want to live. But why would you trouble my small town of 80,000 people with some of these changes? And so what would you say to some of those criticisms about, you know, and why both the province I think you spoke really well, Tim, to why the province needs to lead this, but why does it need to apply to places beyond Toronto and to other, you know, cities and towns across the province?
I'll do a little rotation. Yeah, as I said, this was one we knocked around, and we had various groups on various sides of the issue. But look, I come from small town, and Ian comes from small town Ontario, and Jake's a bit larger city background, but as a perspective, that's particularly for Northern Ontario. And I served in provincial politics. I represented ridings in Niagara for 21 years, and still live there. And you know what, the most common thing I hear from people is, you know, I grew up in Fort Erie, and I always assumed that if I played by the rules, I worked hard, I got my degree, I got a decent job, I could afford a house in the neighborhood I grew up in. And that is not the case in those communities. There's a housing affordability crisis right across the province of Ontario. So why should somebody, you know, think of where I was in my late 20s, for example, why should I be denied the opportunity to get an affordable home in my hometown? Why do I have to move to Toronto? So that's why I think it's compelling to say this should be an opportunity across the province. You're right, Craig, in the analysis of politics, but boy, I don't think we should discriminate against small towns and not have affordable places there too.
I'm happy to jump in next, and I'll use some of the data that came from Scotiabank's chief economist, JF Perot, that ended up in our report and has made its way around. Compared across the G7, Canada's short 1.8 million homes. And so to one of Ian's comments earlier, this isn't really a debate about whether or not we need supply or don't need supply. We're behind the G7 average, which has cascading impacts from there. Ontario's share of that, and so not Toronto, Ontario's share of that is 1.2. And so not everyone wants to live in Toronto. And so we need to get homes built across the province. My wife's from Thunder Bay. I went to school up there. They have shortage of housing. I've seen what's happened to prices there over the years. I did my high school in Peterborough. That's turning increasingly with more transportation into a bit of a bedroom community for some parts of the GTA. That's impacting their pricing. They need more housing. So if you were to flip it on its head and go the other way, Craig, if we only build housing in Toronto, we're basically going to create a different problem, I think, which is a real compact, packed city that has transportation issues, potentially large infrastructure issues under the roads we drive on, potentially pollution issues. Let's give people more choices than just Toronto. And so I think you need to build housing across the full province, small town, medium-sized town, large town. And the report really is intended to come up with market-based solutions. It's not to be prescriptive and have government just throw money and say we need to build housing in this spot specifically. And so market forces will take care of themselves, right? If we clear out the hurdles for people to build homes and to do it in a way where housing can be affordable for people, then we'll end up in a spot where housing ends up in the spot people want it.
So I would like to welcome, I think, Karen from the School of Cities for the next couple of questions.
Thank you all.
And also, as we get further into the Q&A, if our audience, both online and in person, has specific questions for any individual members of the task force, please also feel free to direct your questions appropriately. Right, thank you, sorry.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thanks to the task force. For those who don't know me, I'm Karen Chappell. I'm director of the School of Cities. In my previous life, I worked on housing affordability as a professor at University of California, Berkeley. So thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this very important move forward for the region. I'm going to use my 10 minutes to ask 2 questions. So first, despite being called the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force, and I know I'm not the only one to point this out, there's no real attention paid to affordability in the report, meaning how will this housing supply make it possible for a middle-class family to live in Toronto, let alone a low-income family. There seems to be an assumption that the new housing supply will be affordable to at least middle-income households, and then maybe trickle down to others to alleviate some of the problem. That's what the rules of supply and demand tell us, and it's not unreasonable. There are 2 problems with this assumption in Ontario. The rules of supply and demand don't apply so well in a global city with global demand and global investors. If the market were just Ontario residents, then maybe adding supply would make housing affordable, but it's a global market. And second, you can solve regional affordability problems by adding supply, but effects will be very uneven across neighborhoods. Just look at the 2021 census, came out this week. Downtown added far more housing units than it did population, greater share of housing units than it increased in population. These housing units increased the land values downtown, making it a more expensive place to live so that fewer people can actually live there. Meanwhile, if you're lucky enough to be a landowner downtown, you just made a windfall profit. So my question, did the task force discuss how to deal with the land value uplift that comes from rezoning? Do you have ideas about how to recapture some of that value in order to preserve affordability, both for current residents and people seeking to move in?
It's your turn to go first, but
I'm on.
if you want,
I'm happy to lead on it. and
You-
then
you are?
can-
Okay.
You can back me up. Thank you.
okay.
I thank you. That's really, I appreciate the question that you've asked. And so I think I'd open by saying, I think every member of the task force, and I would anticipate the Ontario government to who we've reported, recommend or recognizes necessary but not sufficient. Right. But I will come back to, as I said, as Jake has reiterated, we do have a housing supply problem in this country. You're right, downtown, we don't necessarily have a lack of 500 square foot condos. There are a lot of those downtown, but we do have a housing supply problem for anyone that wants to start or grow a family in this country. And so our mandate was to address how can we get more housing supply of the right kind in the right places for not just people that are going to live in a 500 square foot condo downtown. But then I will pick up on the next, and so I would submit that yes, and I'm not a housing economist, but yes, my understanding is how it's sticky in terms of the movement of prices, fair enough. But when you have this depth of a housing supply problem, it is a given. If we create more options within neighborhoods, there will be an impact on housing prices. Now I'll go back to necessary but not sufficient. The task force has understandably been criticized for not touching demand side. Our mandate wasn't demand side, and there's a degree of there's only so much that we can focus on in a 2-month period. Also, the provincial government has much more influence over supply side. Federal government, as we know, has a lot of influence over demand side. So I think there's an acknowledgement. Yes, are there things that can be done on demand side? Sure. Everyone in this room and listening tonight, has a list of things. So the task force isn't claiming that this will be a kind of panacea. And then I'll go back to wearing my hat as Habitat for Humanity. Will the recommendations in this report help organizations like mine deliver more affordable housing for low-income families? Yes, they will. Will that be sufficient for organizations like mine and all the other housing nonprofits out there to do what they need to do? No. And I think we did say that clearly in the report. This is necessary, but not sufficient. There is absolutely more work to do on affordable housing and on the various other pieces.
Answer the question. I think Ian's done a good job on that. Particularly the last point is the measures we're proposing have an impact on bringing housing to market, which will have an impact on affordability throughout the continuum. Your 9 homes you built could have been 20, right? To that point. I'll address just some of the upfront preface for the question. And what I'd say is the cost to build, because of whether it's development charges, the time spent on appeals, lawyers, other things, it drives up the value of land, the value of what ultimately gets built. And that's a problem. And so making it a simpler approval process, streamlining it, making it more efficient as of right, which we've already touched on as a group, that will have an impact because the housing price is telescopic throughout a region, right? You see it happening. If you look at where the community of Barrie was in the GTA 10 years ago for an average single family house, where it is now, given transportation, you see the price is telescopic all the way through for affordability. I think it's tricky in this current market to also look at valuation of assets. I think there's pressure coming from the demand side. I think there's a shortfall of supply. And I also think, and I'll put on my economist hat, I also think we find ourselves in a world where we've got record low interest rates, excess liquidity in the system from the central bank, driving up asset values everywhere from fine art into condos in downtown Toronto. And so there is some artificial stimulus that exists in the economy now that drives up asset values. So I know your question was really focused around Toronto and pointing facts that have occurred in this market. I think some of those could be more temporary and artificial. And what we're trying to do is think of simple changes and recommendations that can be made to how we build housing in this province that will have an impact for specifically market-based housing, but will affect other sources of housing and forms of housing.
But see, I do want to tell you what was one of my favorite things about this report is who was there to help. And I can tell you at the task force, our eyes are very much on helping out those who can't get in the market today. And just in introduction, here's who I know Ian and Jake and the rest thought about: the young family who can't buy a house within 2 hours of where they work, the tenant with a good job who worries about where she'll find a new apartment she can afford before the owner decides to sell, the recent graduate will have to stay home for a few more years because they can't afford to rent or buy. We talk about how Black, Indigenous, and disadvantaged people have the greatest challenges. That's who we targeted. That's what this is all about. That's why it's 1.5 million homes. So the notion this wasn't here to help middle class or those aspiring to join the middle class is quite the opposite. Those are the people we had in our mind each and every day when we put these recommendations. One of the reasons why we went to the bold end of the spectrum. 2 other points, and I think we'd hopefully all agree that why we're in this crisis today is largely because there's been a lot of demand and limited supply, basic laws of economics. So I think the converse is equally true. You increase supply, you can help control prices so homeownership comes closer to reach for families. I just fundamentally believe that. I think part of your point also is talking about whether there should be a foreign investment ban or foreign investment tax. It wasn't really part of our mandate to recommend tax policy. We didn't go in that direction in any detail. I'm sure it does have a 15% non-resident tax, as you know. And despite that, we still see, prices going up. So I'm not sure that is an effective demand measure at the end of the day. And I believe we're about 4% foreign ownership currently in the province of Ontario. So I think before you go running down the path, and maybe the government is considering it, there's been some talk about that in the media. Just make sure you got your numbers right as to what's really driving up the issue.
Okay, my second question is the easy one. So by eliminating exclusionary zoning, Ontario is proposing to follow in the footsteps of many US jurisdictions, Minneapolis, Charlotte, the state of Oregon, the state of California, and more. None of these places have yet seen a significant increase in supply. So far, 3 years later, there's just one new building in Minneapolis. California's bill is tied up in lawsuits. How can Ontario get it right where these others have failed? And by the way, this is something we're working on at the school cities, and we have lots of ideas on this, but you guys go.
I thought the major problem in the States was Minneapolis is still tied up in lawsuits. So they've actually not fully or even halfway implemented the policy. So it's not really fair to say they've not done it for 3 years. I don't think it's even been successful for 3 weeks. As a result, and as you mentioned, California is just sort of tied up in political debate. As you know from your experience in your education in the States, right, they're a bit more litigious, courts can drag things down. Our system, if politicians, whatever party, implement these ideas, there's a greater ability to get them done just because of the way our system works. So I get what hasn't happened in the States, but I do have confidence that if politicians at Queen's Park do endorse these policies, they will have an impact and they can happen much more quickly than they get tied up in the States.
I'm actually still thinking about the last part of your first question, which I know we didn't fully answer. I think on this question that you've asked, I think your comment about the School of Cities is doing some work on it. It is going to be important to look at what do we know from looking elsewhere, and how do we get it more right here. But I'll go back to that question. The first question, what are the 3 things I took away? The second one on the list was we know this is the right thing to do. This is intuitive that we should do this. We know that it will lead to greater mixed income communities, et cetera. We know that makes stronger communities. This is the right thing to do. So what is on the list of things that, not for tonight, but that the School of Cities is thinking that others are saying of how do we get it more right than what we've seen elsewhere? And the fact that, some other jurisdictions have been early movers, fantastic. Let's watch, learn, and do better. When I referred to the back end of your first question, I think was, how do you take into account the lift in land values, but the lift in yield that can come out of recommendations like unlimited, height, along major transit corridors. So I want to acknowledge, I think that is a really important question. It is something we all have to keep an eye on. You saw in the affordable housing appendix, you can tell that we did a degree of deliberation on, okay, is inclusionary zoning the right mousetrap for this thing? And how do you do it right, et cetera? Probably don't have it right yet. IZ may not be the right thing, maybe something else, but your question is a good one. If we build more density, there will be lift. How do we translate some of that lift back into this other conversation about affordability at a deeper level? And I will also say, I think in my view, where we haven't done well so far on the inclusionary zoning kind of thing is the assumption of, oh, let's just make the developers pay for it, right? Like we don't tell the grocery stores to discount groceries for people who can't afford groceries. Like we have to figure this out in a thoughtful way.
Colleagues have answered it well. I'll keep us moving.
I would actually like to follow up on Karen's question because I do think the idea that broad upzoning, generally because you're allowed to do more with property, does lead to an increase in land values. And I know there are a lot of advocates, especially here at More Neighbors Toronto, that really like the idea of land value taxes because it is a way of capturing the value of the commons that a location provides. And it can also encourage more conversion of property in places that are more desirable. I know that we suggested it to you guys in our report. And so I would like to know what you guys think about land value taxes. as a potential solution, even if we know that the politics around land value taxes might be challenging.
How would the land value tax work exactly? I think that's one of the things.
Yeah, so impact both values of total property and
Yeah.
the value of the built form. So the value of the land is just the subtraction between those two things. So the data already exists. So you could do a split rate property tax, one for the dwelling and one for the land.
I know my colleagues will speak to that. And you had another one too that, again, I think More Neighbors did a really, really good job in their report. You had another one too with respect to, I forget, Eric, the name of it, where you would have a different taxation in the neighborhood depending on how friendly they were towards new development. So we did bat those things around. I think be very frank about it, if I can. Chair, we found there's a layer of complexity to those issues, and we wanted to make sure that our report pierced through. It was very focused and bold, and didn't get into a lot of weeds. And in truth, that's going to be the government's decision, right? It'll be the legislature. If they move forward with legislation, if political parties adopt it, then they'll probably look at a bit more of that detail level.
Yeah.
But that was really why we wanted to have a report that had clarity, that was bold, and was focused in its recommendations. So it's not only that the panel was against these per se, we just thought that was a level of detail that we didn't see fitting in with the report overall.
I'll weigh in. I think targeted taxation is always tricky. And so let's say I've got my grandmother who's living in the home where she raised my mother, and I've gone and visited her every year, and all of a sudden she's on CPP and her taxes start rising because things have been built around her that are driving it up. I agree, we want housing passed around and transitioned. There are complications that can arise from that. And so we say right now, we don't like the concept that people can't afford to live where they want to live because housing's too expensive. Taxation needs to be thoughtful so that we don't end up in a spot where people can't afford to live because they can't afford the taxes of where they live. So the areas where we did address taxation was around, it ties a bit back to Karen's last question, was around purpose-built rental and how those are treated over time. Because it is between rent control and the taxation of purpose-built rental, it has really stunted the growth of rental property in the GTA, but in other parts of the province as well. And so so you're trying to come up with both a stick and a carrot with the land value tax, and I get those concepts. I need to understand better how it would actually work in practice so that it doesn't penalize people who can't afford an escalator on their tax ultimately because of what's happening around them.
And do you have another question?
I'll open it up.
Great. So now we're going to open up to questions for the audience and as well as the Q&A. So continue to keep the questions on Zoom coming forward, but we will start. It looks like someone already has a question. So please introduce yourself and ask away.
Sure. I'm Phil Potvin. I'm a land use planning and environmental lawyer. I run the Ontario Environment Program at Environmental Defense. I'm also a U of C Daniels alum for way back when. But I, just as a starting point, I do want to express the relief that we feel at Environmental Defense that the report at least acknowledges what environmental NGOs and housing advocates have been saying for ages, which is that the main barrier to increasing the supply of private market housing is not a shortage of greenfield land within settlement area boundaries, but rather exclusionary planning rules that prevent us from adding a lot more and more compact homes to existing built-up areas where we know, because I've spent a lot of money on polling, people actually want to live. Housing is too expensive for the same reasons that most Ontarians also can't comfortably get by without a car. And so your housing affordability task force report has really provided a valuable input to a lot of the local land needs assessment processes and MCRs. Late in the process as they are, I can say your report was a key factor in the decision today. Just a few hours ago, I just came from Halton Regional Council, where they elected to approve substantially higher intensification than they had originally planned for. And this meant that they were able to avoid a settlement area boundary expansion altogether. And we had something like, I think by a margin of 58-1, people showing up to call for more intensification within existing built up areas. So that was great. And you pushed us over the line on that. But environmental defense is concerned about a few points where, and we think they're errors. We want to make sure, and that's where the question is, where there seem to be some recommendations that are framed very broadly in ways that may not have been thought of, that we wonder if they were intended that way or if it was just an oversight. So one, the restoration of developer appeals of official plans was removed to begin with because it was a major obstacle to zoning changes that actually would increase affordability. So it's very difficult to separate developers from individual landowners, and that can prevent those changes from being passed quickly. Secondly, the way that the increased as of right densities, which we support, were framed, they would apply to McMansions that don't actually increase the number of units, as well as unit developments that increase the number of units. And I was wondering if it was intentional or whether actually it might make more sense to frame that specifically to projects that increase the number of units. Our feeling is that they will actually be counterproductive and drive up costs otherwise, right? The costs of each single family house will go up otherwise. And third, there was a suggestion that there should be continuation of some settlement area boundary expansion. And we know based on the supply of land within settlement area boundaries, that in order to do that, you'd have to increase the amount of land allocated for each unit, which would drive up the per unit cost. In order to get to a settlement area boundary expansion, you'd have to do that. And then finally, there are elements that seemed like they were frankly unrelated to housing at all and a little vindictive. And one was the fact that the $10,000 filing fee for third-party appeals, the Ontario Land Tribunal applies all sorts of appeals. It applies aggregate pits, warehouse developments that would pave wetlands, et cetera. And this would apply to NGOs who are filing third-party appeals of those as well. That has nothing to do with the supply of housing. So was it the intention to just broadly screen out third-party appeals at the OMB, or was it intended to narrowly focus it on housing projects that will actually increase the number of units? And these are not just my things. These are observations that came up at the Ontario Bar Association conference.
Phil, this is
Yep.
phenomenal. I think, everyone's almost lost the bullet list.
Yep.
So let's address the 4 questions that we have. And I will ask for everyone else asking questions to remember, try to keep it to under a minute and try to keep the questions specific so that we don't lose them, right? Because there are a lot of people who are interested in having this conversation. Very great points, by the way. I just want to make sure that others get chances as well.
Sure, and these
So,
questions
for
are
sure.
on behalf of the Daily Bread Food Bank and Eco Justice as well, who weren't able to be here.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah.
Might be shorter in my answer than the question, Phil, so don't take any offense to that. These are recommendations at the end of the day. Ultimately, and I think Tim made this point earlier, the policy matters. So how the province decides to implement these recommendations will be critically important. And there will be considerations that need to be given to different matters. I think the challenge is we look at where the housing guidelines, and we had an infographic in the report, have gotten to. We've become so specific and tailored in what we approve and what we don't approve. I think the high level philosophy of, and it's where I started tonight, more density, better approval processes will get us towards our bold goal of 1.5 and more towards the G7 average of housing. I think those are critical principles. How it ends up showing up in policy, we'll defer to the province to figure out how they want to tackle that at the end of the day. So I won't get into some of the specifics of your questions, but if we make this too complicated, that's what contributed to us getting to where we are today. One of the facts that I learned, maybe something that I learned that I really enjoyed through this process, back to your first question, really was we built more houses in the 70s, every year of the 70s, than what we did last year. And I don't know how that's possible. And part of the reason why is because of the disruption and how hard it is to get things built. So I won't tackle the 4 specific. I don't know if Ian or Tim want to add anything in, but directionally, intensification, so more density, better approval processes. Our intention isn't to create mass collateral damages around it, but there will, as my wife tells me, there's eggs broken when we make omelets.
Effects that are too severe, or going too far or not going far enough. I'm talking about perverse effects that may have, there are a few points that these organizations identified where they might actually have the opposite effect that you're looking
So
for. just
Phil,
based on the
I think
details.
these are really important points, but remember this task force report is really to inform the province on how to take legislative action. And so when you think about some of these issues, like, does allowing 4 stories also apply to a single family home? I think it's an excellent point. And when legislation comes forward, that's probably the best place to make that point, because then you can encourage that use of, space to be more for multifamily homes rather than a single family home, right? And so I'd suggest for the task force sake that we can't get bogged down by the weeds of what they've written, because in general, the principle applies and we need to consider the legislation.
That's what we were hoping to hear.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
so I
sure.
just want to speak to a couple of things that jumped out at me in your comments. I really appreciate you opened by talking about sprawl, that we purposely are saying, yes, not more of that. I come from a 5th generation farming family. Only 5% of the land in Ontario now is agricultural. So for food security, it is critical that we're extremely judicious in using agricultural land. So that's my infomercial for the farmers in the province, and I appreciate you giving me a chance to say it. I also appreciate the question asked about the $10,000 on the appeals. I think that's we recognize that sounds bad. That's a lightning rod number for people to notice. And I just want to speak to the logic. Your comment is a good one. There are potentially guardrails that should be put around it. We are a housing task force. Our intention in talking about $10,000 is really to say an appeal that is about having a housing development in a neighborhood not go forward has 2 costs to society. Number 1, it will increase the cost of that development. It has for us, the Habitat for Humanity, when we've been appealed. And number 2, the intention is usually to not build at all or to build less. So the point we're making is, okay, right now, one person can go to the bank, could pull $400 out of their ATM and put an appeal in. And by saying $10,000, it's mathematically saying, so you'd want to have at least 25 people in a community that are willing to spend $400, 25 times 4 is 10,000, to make it worth the societal trade-off of pushing up the cost of housing and decreasing housing that can be built for folks who need it. So that was the logic around it. Does it maybe need some guardrails and specificity? Yeah, perhaps. And that comes back to Eric's saying of what we were trying to do is put direction and intent and lots more work to do.
Great. So I'm actually going to take the next question from online, and thank you. It was an excellent conversation. I appreciate it, Phil. So this comes from Joy. Taken together, the proposals from the task force could significantly reduce the cost of development. That's a good thing. But how do we ensure those savings, some of which are at a public cost, are passed on to purchasers and renters?
I don't want to go first every time, but I'm not an economist. I'm taking offense to that, Ian. On one hand, we have this, and on the other hand, we have that, and then we have nothing. Sorry to the people who are in U of T economics programs. So this comes back to, so Joy, thanks for your question. This does come back to supply and demand. And so I think there is always the risk of, if we reduce the cost of development, that at the end of the day, you're going to have potentially wider margins for developers. But I would say this isn't all just about developers building. Some of the missing middle will be filled in by people who are real estate owners now. The person who builds the laneway house will benefit from it. The person who builds the extra suite in their basement will benefit from it. I also think, and this is where I'll turn into a bit more of the banker on you, Ian, if we reduce those charges, if we get housing construction to be more affordable or have lower costs associated with it, what you'll end up seeing is these builders are looking for a return on their capital. They're not going to immediately turn around and say, well, I need 2x the return on my capital as I had previously. So if they're happy with getting a X% return on their capital today, maybe they get X and a little bit more, or X with a little bit less, depending on where interest rates are and financing charges are. But at the end of the day, if they're willing to accept a certain return today, if their cost of goods sold goes down, they may accept the same return moving forward. And so you'll see, well, now we can offer this house and make the same profits we used to before. We can get it to market faster. Our approvals process is cleaner. We're tied up less in court longer, so we have lower lawyer costs. So there can be benefits from it. So it doesn't have to change their return on capital.
I'll add
Yes,
a little
go
bit
for it.
to great answer by Jake and Joy. Thanks for your comments. I just want to add something, and I'll get into Joy's question. If you like the report, or you like even parts of the report, I just want to encourage folks at home or here in the room, let your MPP or the political parties know about it. I know as CEO of AREA, we've been reached out by all four parties. What do you like? What don't you like? All that kind of stuff. Because they realize this is probably a top 3 issue, and for any in the room, a #1 issue around housing affordability. So they're all looking at it. So let them know how you feel. And I would encourage the positive. I would focus more on what you like, because politicians respond a bit more to that. And some of the editorial comments, I think, are also making political parties much more interested in pursuing this and taking on the tough choices that are necessary to bring home ownership closer to reach. So I just want to encourage that. And if they hear from groups like Toronto Region Board of Trade, More Neighbors, you do an op-ed, that kind of stuff, as somebody who spent 21 years there at Queen's Park, it matters, especially on such a big issue. So I just want to start with that. And so, Joy, I want to encourage you. Thanks for your kind words. And let the politicians who are now reviewing the report know how you feel. So I think there is a risk, Joy, if they do this in a small way. So if they create a small number of homes and give a few breaks here or there, or really narrow cast these choices, you're not going to really make a big enough impact on supply, and the demand will all flock there. So it's like playing musical chairs, and you add the 3rd chair and there's 100 people going around. It's not going to make a difference on prices. But if you do it in a bold way, I think you put enough chairs there on the floor, that helps get prices closer to reach for hardworking people in the province of Ontario. I think it's the way you got to do it. The developer doesn't really go out and set a price and everybody's going to pay it no matter what. What happens is the developer, or as Jake said, the single homeowner, or somebody who wants to add a suite to their place for rental, a granny suite, they respond to the demand of the market. And the more people that can spread out, there's more homes available. That's how you control prices.
Just the other piece here, like, it's a critical question. It needs more examination of what Joy's asked, but we also have to recognize uncertainty costs money. So as the developers know, developing anything brings with it a lot of uncertainty as to what your yield will be, how much you can actually build, and certainly uncertainty around how long before you can start build. And I remember 4 years ago talking to a developer who, just said to me, like, all of this is just driving up our cost of capital. Like, the investors, investors have to allow for the uncertainty. So the recommendations we've made will increase certainty around how much you can build, and to some degree, how fast you can build it. That does have a beneficial effect on your borrowing costs. And then Joy's question is, how do we make sure that flows to the consumer? Good and important question. But so there's a problem to solve, but the fact that uncertainty costs us a lot of money as buyers.
Great answer. And I'd like to welcome Ramsey to ask his question.
Thanks, Eric. Cool. So my name is Ramsey. I'm a volunteer with More Neighbors. And I want to say I'm ecstatic about the report when I saw it. It's amazing. It's really exciting for the future of Ontario. And Tim, I did already talk to my MPP about it. So don't worry. Great. My question is, I'm sure like a lot of the stuff in the report is controversial and there might be some stuff that wasn't included. Is there anything in particular that you were excited to see made it in, or that didn't make it in that you wanted to see? Thanks.
It's a blur. I don't remember. I'm going to leave it at that.
That's a great question, Ramsey, and thank you for talking to your MPP. And I'll say what I teased at the beginning. I don't know how many folks have kids, but the expression, it's like choosing among your favorite kid. Although as the oldest, I'll say it's the oldest. But it's hard to pick one. But I think More Neighbors was an outstanding report. It was one of my favorites, and I think you see a lot of your ideas in this report and some others. And Eric, Jake answered your question much more elegantly than I did. Just some of them were just at a layer of complexity that we hadn't the time to figure out all the pluses and minuses, but we're confident that the province will look through some of those other ideas that were there. The chairman will have last word on this, but when you do this as a group, you kind of want to come out as a group. So every one of us is going to have our top 5 and maybe the 5 that were yeah. But when you go in this beginning, it's all about the mission, and I think solidarity, that we stand behind the report fully, is the best way to go forward with it to actually get it moving. How's that sound for Dodge?
Yeah.
Are we going to get other Dodges here, or do we have?
I'm flattered that Ramsey thinks that after we included 55 recommendations that we didn't actually include something. So there wasn't much that ended up on the cutting room floor, to be honest. I think we continued to find unanimity around some core buckets, like I've said, around density, some of the other topics, and there was just recommendations that infilled or got consolidated underneath that.
What was
Thanks.
missing that was your favorite?
Oh, well, a land value tax.
There you go. Then
Um,
put it in the More Neighbors op-ed that will run in the Globe and Mail later this week. Put that one in.
I'm sure we have a couple members who would love to write that.
Yeah, we definitely. do.
So I'm going to ask another a question
Thanks.
from our chat, and I'm going to paraphrase it because it was a little bit lengthy. So, do we need more housing, or do we need to put the brakes on speculation in the housing market? First-time home buyers can't compete with people who are already well capitalized from other investments, whether or not they're domestic or foreign. So should we be placing limits on existing properties that had been under primary ownership from being purchased by investors, so that money gets targeted towards creating new homes instead?
To just give one really quick thing, go try to find a rental apartment in Owen Sound. In a way, the speculation question is I think quite a bit a big city question, not exclusively, but it's a big city question. So this is a bit of yes and yes. We need more housing supply. Go try to find a rental apartment in Owen Sound, full stop. Try to recruit a family doc to Owen Sound who can afford to find a place to live. Like, we've got our towns and communities need housing, and it's not because of speculation. Does speculation have to be addressed? Yes, probably. But there's a supply issue.
Anyone else have any comments on it?
Yeah, good question. Good paraphrasing. My response would be, I don't think you solve a problem always by penalizing someone else. And so I think that's risky. And if at the heart of the question, as paraphrased, is really around how do you stop speculation because it impacts others' ability to own, I think supply solves for that, right? Like, to the game of musical chairs, I'll come back to you, Tim. That third chair becomes more valuable when the fourth one goes away. And guess what comes next? The second one's then most valuable when the third one goes away. So I think creating a market where asset prices, housing specifically, and land value continues to go up, all that does is fuel investors who are seeking returns and keeps the treadmill rolling. So I think bringing on supply will hopefully reduce scarcity value, which will hopefully then quell some speculation.
Great answer. Next, I think is Rocky.
I'm Rocky. I'm a volunteer with More Neighbors. I just want to say really quickly, oh my God, like you impressed me with the report. Like, every time I turn pages and I'm like, oh my God, it's getting better and better. So fantastic. I think this is more a question for Ian, though if either of the rest of the two of you want to chip in, that's great. Ian, you said something earlier where, especially in your space of social housing, the things in this report are necessary, but not sufficient to enable you to really deliver on that deeply affordable housing that is needed by a lot of people in this province. And I'm wondering, let's assume that most or all of the things in this report come to pass or are passed in the policy. What more do you think would be needed to really enable developers like Habitat for Humanity and others to really deliver in this space?
Thank you for asking. I'll try to be brief.
Fair.
So for the first comment is land. You know, any nonprofit affordable housing provider is competing against the for-profits for land. And so again, we weren't supposed to talk about, our mandate wasn't government land, but one of the places to think about when you say, okay, we need some affordability is government land. So there's a recommendation there about, surely when we sell government land, we need to grab that once in a lifetime opportunity to create some affordable housing. The key side that was announced just yesterday, 800 affordable units. Yes, excellent, more of that. So there's the first part is you need solutions for land. Tim commented on the, whatever it's called, the Ontario Housing Delivery Fund. It would be my hope that the government, number one, will make a sizable commitment to that fund. And you can tell we didn't put a lot of, meat on what that would be. It would be my hope that incentives would include incentives to enable affordable housing. You saw some fine print about, yes, we're saying, have municipalities exempt affordable housing from DCs, but have the province grant at least some of that back. So, we all recognize, to deliver affordable housing in our communities, you have to put some of society's money into it. It's society's responsibility. So it means some government money has to come into it. There's a bunch of stuff that can be done with tax that I won't spend more time here on doing, but so there's tax levers that would make a big difference to all affordable housing providers. So there's 3 of them.
It's on the report. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the report. It's great.
Just because of the long queue here, I'm going to allow another question from the audience here, and then we'll ask another one from the Q&A. And we are running up. We have 10 minutes until 8:30. So, depending on whether or not this is a long question, we might end here or we might ask one more. Anyways, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ken Greenberg. And for tonight, I'm going to wear the hat of a resident of King Spadina, downtown Toronto. So I want to applaud you for everything you've done in terms of opening up the yellow belt, getting rid of the exclusion. I think that's tremendous. I buy largely the supply argument, but here's the problem. I've lived in King Spadina for the last over 20 years. In that period, an astonishing amount of housing has been built at high densities. In my little neighborhood, we've added 20,000 people. Virtually none of that housing, and this is my big regret as a resident, virtually none of that housing is available to the construction workers who are building the housing, to the teachers, to the cops, to anybody who does anything but working in the tech industry or some form of very lucrative employment. So we missed the whole wave. And you talked about the Anglosphere. If we look outside the Anglosphere, other societies, wealthy, highly educated like ours, have come to the sensible conclusion that the private market cannot, where housing is a commodity, provide housing, not just for the poorest, but for a very significant part of the population. So look at any Scandinavian country, look at the Netherlands, look at Germany, Helsinki, I'll just give you that as an example. They're building fantastic new transit-oriented neighborhoods. 40% of the housing in those neighborhoods is not market housing. It's some form of cooperatives, various forms of mixed income housing. Why don't we come to that obvious conclusion?
Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Part of it may be the mask. I apologize.
Ken Greenberg.
Ken, thank you. Thank you for your very thoughtful question. And I think my first home in Toronto was a condo on Charlotte Street, ironically enough, which you'll probably know roughly where it is. And I've seen King and Spadina area change over the years. And I agree. I think what you've just described is at the heart of the crisis, right? Like we've taken housing, and the scarcity of housing in this province has led to there not being enough housing of all kinds for people. And one of the things we heard through our consultative process, one of our first consultations was with a union. And I'm going to probably tangent into a couple different areas, but how do they make sure there's housing for their union members, right? If we're going to build 1.5 million houses, by the way, we're going to need more trades, right? It's not going to be to build all 1.5 because some of it will be infilled. There's a lot of tributary challenges that we face coming with this crisis, whether it's the fabric of a community, not having appropriate teachers in it, doctors in Owen Sound. All of these are challenges. And I think thoughtful planning is going to be critical. Ramsey, we could have come up with 120 recommendations if we wanted to broaden it into other areas like target housing that will, we could get into immigration policy. We tried to stay focused on market-based solutions for housing affordability, but what you've described is a problem that does require a solution, and recommendations will affect some of that. I do think if you look around the world, Toronto's a global city, a livable city. You will have it probably mimic some spots like we see in other parts of the world, like Manhattan, like London, where it's so desirable to live there that it does squeeze out some portions of the community, which isn't desirable. So having better planning that thinks about all forms of housing will be important. But it's a great question, it's very thoughtful, and that's at the heart of the reason why I'm highly engaged in this topic. I've got 2 boys, 12 and 10, that I want them to have the option to live in Toronto no matter what they're doing.
So are there
Sorry,
any
that was
comments on
longer.
this? No, I just want to dig on the issue because social housing was a big part of our report as well.
Mhm.
And so even if it didn't make it into this report, I do want to ask, like, do the task force members think that there is a place for this type of construction, given that there are cities like Singapore, which is English speaking, that delivers about 80 to 90% of its housing through social building, Vienna, 50%. So, I would just like to push you guys a little bit on this question.
Yeah. So in the report, Ian, I'll turn it over to you quickly in a second. In the report, we did kind of tip of the hat saying like this needs to be considered as well as government land and others, but we stayed away from it in the formal part of the report. I know Ian will have some thoughts on this.
A lot. So, yeah, there's like Strasbourg, was another place that I looked at of just, where I think it's 50% of the housing is government built, and then it's mixed income, et cetera. There's lots of, wish that was us kind of cities to look at in a way. So I think I'm mostly just kind of, for me, I'm bringing this back to the now we know. We know we have a problem. We know we've waited too long to act on this problem. We know it has a lot of pieces. It's like, a car crash, trauma victim coming into an ER. There's a lot of different things to work on simultaneously, but start on something. And so the notion again of, the directions we pointed here, this is let's get started. This notion of perfect is the enemy of good. Let's not kind of run in circles trying to find the perfect. There's a lot here to get started on. I would like to see a affordable housing task force, right? To get to do a deeper dive into some of these things that, are coming up, et cetera. So there's more to this story, but it is absolutely okay, but we know there's a problem. We know the directions in this report will help. Some of it's a bit blunt instrument. We may have to, tweak it later, but let's get started doing this. And then let's say, okay, now here's a couple more pieces. Let's start chasing them down and get moving on them.
Task Force, Housing Affordability Task Force. Isn't that what you were supposed to be?
Making our audio visual jump around on mics. We did try
I'll leave
to,
it at
no. Maybe I'll take the last word then. There is a difference between affordable housing and solving for housing affordability. And we tried to kind of tip of the hat in some of the recommendations to the importance of affordable housing as things are built. But the real focus was on housing affordability and market-based solutions.
I would also like to suggest that they were not responsible for how they got named. They were asked to, to sort of deliver on a set of conditions from the province. And so, the idea, and this is a really famous battle in how we just go to language, right? Because when you say affordable housing, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, like housing that is affordable. And that's kind of what this task force was tasked with. Whereas affordable housing is also a defined term, at least in the city of Toronto, for designated targeted under market housing. And sometimes how that language has gotten used has actually confused the debate. And this is kind of an example of they weren't allowed to actually talk about non-market solutions as part of this report. Wait, Tim.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
this just probably won't be real quick, but to be honest, look, I Nothing to apologize here. This is a fantastic report that's going to make a difference for so many people across the province of Ontario, and I think can change the rest of Canada as well, right? It's a fantastic report. But we actually did comment, like 29 to 31 or 32 does talk about affordable housing in the formal sense, right? Non-market housing. So even though the line was strong, we still weighted in. There's some pretty exciting stuff in there, and maybe the path for a future task force right in that area. One that I thought was really cool is the province. There's been two big things in the pandemic. The province made a ton of money. Housing is one, land transfer tax. Anybody guess the other one? Alcohol sales. I've contributed to that myself, I think, during this crisis. But the province has a huge windfall on land transfer tax, as does the city of Toronto. So one thing we point out is set up a special fund out of that strictly for affordable housing. Because what we heard from a lot of providers was they can't afford the land to put up any new housing. So this would be funds that would go to those providers to build co-op housing, not-for-profit housing, homeless shelters. So I think we did actually, even though it wasn't our mandate, we have some pretty good stuff in there still. And so check it out. And my last comment, Eric, because I want to go on as long as I promised. I just want to say, I think from 21 years in politics and now what I do with Real Estate Association, I've seen tons of reports on everything. But More Neighbors and Toronto Region Board of Trade, I think were just outstanding and two of my favorites there. And they were the two types of reports that I like. Well, you guys did really well, a lot of ideas, but you really had motive in there. Who is this about? And you pointed out that the decisions of councilors or politicians and who the real victims are. Like you guys are really effective in that and motivational. You'll see that reflected in our report. And you guys focus like on 5 things. You just nailed the hell out of 5 things, particularly exclusionary zoning. One thing we didn't get to tonight, more types of ownership as well, different ownership models. The TRBOT did a really good job on that. So I just want to say to you guys as we're wrapping up, you had outstanding reports and you should be very proud of the work that you've done and keep pushing.
Yep. So speaking of the Toronto Region Board of Trade, I am about to invite Craig up, but I just wondering if any of the task force members had any closing thoughts before I do.
That was mine.
Mostly, I'll just echo the comment about if you like what's in here, help the government out. This government doesn't have a lot of time to make decisions. You know, let MPPs of all stripes know what you like here and urge them, let's get on with doing something. So that's I'll go back to this thing of it's easy to blame the developers. This is on us. You know, we set the rules and the framework for what the developers build, how they build it, you know, what the taxes are. This is on us. So let's use, you know, what's in the report, this opportunity to make this a watershed moment where we started to kind of turn this ship.
Yeah, no, in addition to the people hosting tonight, thanks everyone who's here and online for their engagement on the topic. I think that type of engagement from all parts of the community and all parts of the province and industry is important to making change happen. If it was just partial engagement, we'd have problems, but I think we're going to see changes because of the high degree of alignment that does exist across a bunch of constituencies and different levels of government. So thanks everyone, stay engaged.
Fantastic. Thank you all for this evening. I'd like to invite Craig up to give some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Eric, and I will be brief. First, I want to start by thanking you for doing such a great job of moderating the Q&A this evening. Thank you. To everyone who asked questions, and our collective apologies to those who didn't get a chance. Huge thanks to Jake, to Ian, to Tim for your answers and for all of your work along the way on this task force report. We've heard a lot of really great things tonight about the task force report, I think for a reason. And the challenge is, if we look back in Ontario's history, there is unfortunately, we probably fill this room with the number of great reports that have collected dust on a shelf and sat there and didn't actually result in change. I think that's why this is so exciting, because we see the momentum and we see the alignment really building here around the opportunity to see this report translate into action and translate into changes in Toronto, in cities across the region, and cities across the province. To really make a difference in this issue that is affecting all of us. So I guess I'll just close by echoing the words of our panelists, that this change isn't going to happen on its own, and it's not going to happen without our efforts and our actions. So we need to be talking to our elected officials, both at the municipal level and the provincial level. We need to be talking to our parents, to our neighbors, to our friends, and explaining why this is a critical issue for our society and for our economy. The board did a study last year with Wood Green that found that the cost of the GTA economy of housing is already over $8 billion a year. So there's real dollars at stake, and there's also the real opportunity and future of those of us in the room and the other ones that we know and love that want to be able to live in our communities. So you know, the window before the next election is short, and so I think let's collectively keep the pressure on so that we can look back on this report as really the watershed moment when we had the opportunity to change and actually start improving the housing situation in the province. So thanks again to everyone here, to the task force members, to everyone watching at home, and have a great night.